For almost a decade, Qatar Airways has been the darling of the commercial aviation industry, offering luxury cabins and lounges for its passengers and providing them with a level of service and comfort that only a handful of airlines can offer today. And along with Emirates, Etihad, and Singapore Airlines, they've come to define luxury and comfort for the commercial aviation industry in the 21st century. This is an airline that won Airline of the Year more times than France has won the World Cup. And speaking of the World Cup, Qatar Airways has sunk millions of dollars in the competition just to be its official airline. Like with most airlines from the Middle East, Qatar Airways is actively financed by its own government with money from gas exports. The country of Qatar is sitting on one of the largest natural gas reserves in the world, and this wealth has helped the country enter an age of prosperity that the average Qatari citizen can afford to retire in any country they want and never work a day in their lives. And the wealth that the Qatari government receives from its gas exports has built Doha from this to this. On top of that, the Qatari government subsidizes almost every aspect of their citizens' lives, from free education, free healthcare, lower costs for food, no income taxes. You get the picture. But it doesn't stop there. The government actively invests gas profits into a sovereign wealth fund, but more importantly, it pours money into their own industries and companies, like Qatar Airways. When Qatar Airways started operations in 1994, it didn't exactly start the way it currently is now, with a modern fleet or luxury cabins, or enough financial backing to contend with the European and US-based airlines at the time. You see, at the time, the Qatari government had co-ownership of the Middle East's former flag airline, Gulf Air. And while Qatar Airways slowly grew during the 90s, by 2002, almost 2 decades after Emirates had been created, the government of Qatar withdrew from Gulf Air, allowing it to focus on Qatar Airways. But it wouldn't be fair to give all the credit to the Qatari government. After all, they only provided the money. Much of Qatar Airways' success and controversies can be credited to this man, Akbar al-Baker, who's been its CEO since 1997. A brutally honest man whose extreme wealth and influence allows him to be a total douche. And while US airlines struggle to maintain profits with competition from international airlines as well as from low-cost airlines, government-subsidized airlines from the Middle East have thrived in this environment. And thanks to the government subsidies and a somewhat extreme approach to management, al-Baker was able to steer Qatar Airways into the modern 5-star luxury airline it is today. Like all major airlines, Qatar Airways relies on the hub-and-spoke model, with the core of their operations being conducted at Hamad International Airport in Doha. And like their Middle Eastern counterparts, Qatar Airways has always pushed for passenger experience across their products and services. But not only that, you see, in the past few years, Qatar Airways has been on a bit of a shopping spree, expanding its passenger capacity on some of its routes with the A380. It has the largest orders of A350s at 76. They've added the latest Boeing jets like the 787 Dreamliner and the 7779 to their fleet, meaning that the airline is set to receive a new jet every 10 days in 2018. Ever since Qatar Airways made a flight to the US in 2007, the airline, although I should really say the Qatari government, has heavily invested in expanding its routes to the US. Why is this important? Well, for the longest time, the routes to and from the Middle East from the United States have been served by European and US-based airlines. In the 90s, if you were to travel from any part of the Middle East to the US, you would have to board a European airline and take a connecting flight to the US from hubs like Heathrow in the UK or Schiphol in Amsterdam. A flight from India to the US used to go through the Middle East, then Europe, then the United States, or from India to Europe, then the United States. With hubs in the Middle East, that trip is cut shorter by having a connecting flight directly from Dubai or Qatar to the United States, since India and the Middle East are closer to each other. And so for nearly a decade, countries in the Middle East have aggressively competed to be international travel hubs. I mean, just take a look at their location. They're basically in the middle of everything. Whilst Qatar Airways' hub is smaller than its neighbor Emirates, it still serves as the second largest hub in the region, moving over 30 million passengers in 2016, with Qatar Airways making up over 70%, or 26 million passengers that passed through Doha in 2016. easily beating close rivals Etihad for second place amongst the Gulf airlines. Qatar Airways, Emirates, and Etihad are infamous for receiving government subsidies that give them a huge financial advantage when competing in the international commercial aviation market. On top of that, according to an IATA report, jet fuel for the Middle East airlines are far lower in comparison to other countries. In fact, fuel is subsidized by the government for the entire country. To keep things simple, subsidies allow the airline to offer lower ticket prices versus the actual cost of operating the airline and the cost of the aircraft itself. And the result? As of 2018, there are 0 US-based carriers serving direct flights on the US GCC routes, and 31 flights from the Gulf Airlines, basically creating a monopoly between the Gulf Airlines and locking out competition from the US. And it's because of this that the 3 largest airlines in the US have gone to war with those in the Middle East. Let's face it, US airlines aren't especially well liked, with incidents like this and this. But with the recent anti-competitive complaints from the US airlines, Qatar Airways has had to revise their strategy. According to the Open Skies Agreement, airlines such as Qatar Airways aren't exactly playing fair. According to the agreement, airlines from different countries can fly into each other's airspace provided that the government does not interfere in any way. And that includes subsidies. And subsidies have allowed Qatar Airways to enter and overwhelm direct flights between the Middle East and the US, while at the same time making it difficult for US carriers to compete with the airline's product, service, and competitive prices. In defense of the US airlines and for the sake of simplicity, most companies owned by Qataris or are in part owned by GCC nationals don't pay corporate income tax in Qatar, meaning Qatar Airways gets to keep most of its profits, while the United States has one of the highest corporate income taxes in the world. In the meantime, airlines from the US can breathe a sigh of relief as things for Qatar Airways were about to get worse. As of 2017, Qatar has been under a blockade by its neighbors Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt, resulting in a ban for all Qatar Airways flights to those countries. And those destinations are the airline's biggest markets. And on top of that, Qatar Airways uses the airspaces of those countries for their international flights, forcing the airline to use longer routes into international airspace. For a wealthy country like Qatar, money solves all problems, right? Since the blockade began, let's just say Qatar Airways has been shopping for friends. The blockade has also pushed the airline to settle its dispute with the US-based carriers in early 2018 by promising to publicly disclose its financials. And if the boycott continues, the Qatari government has even promised to provide an increase in capital to the airline. The rise of countries like Dubai or Qatar isn't just based on its wealth or its regional importance, but also its access to an abundance of cheap labor, namely cheap labor from Asia and Africa. To get a better understanding of how this plays out in favor of Qatar Airways, let's take a look at the base wages of a flight attendant starting their career. According to the wages reported on Glassdoor, American airline flight attendants start with $26 an hour, while Qatar Airways pays $17. The difference is quite obvious. By offering their people less pay than their US counterparts and having exorbitantly high attrition rates, Qatar Airways is able to keep its labor costs relatively low. But let's not stop there. When you think of 5-star airlines, you wouldn't expect a United Nations body to call out Qatar Airways on its labor practices. But in 2015, the International Labor Organization has had to shame the airline into providing better working conditions for its employees, especially its female cabin crew. This is one of the richest airlines in the world, with labor practices that strip away some of the most basic human rights, like, for example, controlling their cabin crew's social media posts and private activities while they're off duty, surveillance of cabin crew while off duty, direct and indirect discrimination on the basis of your gender, not being allowed to marry in the first 5 years of service, and being automatically terminated for not getting permission to marry. And very recently, the CEO making a sexist comment that women are incapable of doing the job of a CEO. But the very worst being, the airline terminating staff who are pregnant. As an airline, Qatar Airways does a lot of things right, providing value for its passengers with a high-quality product and service that most airlines dream of. But as a company, not so much. Their over-reliance on their government and their flawed labor practices stop them from being great. But when I reflect on the current state of the commercial aviation industry around the world, with growing competition from budget airlines, lower ticket prices, and how we're spoiled for choice when it comes to travel, I'm reminded of what this airline provides for its customers, an in-flight experience that delights and excites for those who fly on their wings.